These are the observations of a newcomer. I'm no expert on Bergen. Heck, I've only lived here like 10 months. But what follows are my effort to sort of disentangle something that has caught my attention. Living in a town where the forest-urban boundary is so sharply defined is new to me. And I keep wondering, how does Bergen balance the tension between managing your natural surroundings, preserving the structures of history, while accommodating a growing community? When you are surrounded by 1,000 years of history, you cannot help but wonder how Bergen, Norway arrived at this particular place and time. There is intrinsic value in examining the past to frame the decisions of today. So the question is, how does Bergen's then shape Bergen's now? Perhaps more than most towns, Bergen is defined by place. The fjords, the mountains, and the weather all identified Bergen as unique. This is a community that protects its heritage. It's satisfying to see someplace where little has changed in 60 years, or a century. Or still the same 150 years later. It's a cosmopolitan city surrounded by nature, but there is a common belief in most communities that for a city to remain vital, it needs to grow. Most cities grow out, creating an ever-expanding periphery of urbanization, swallowing forest and farmland. Here in Bergen city center, there is evidence of urbanization, with limited open space in the core and green space largely relegated to the periphery. This sort of urbanization often feels gradual, with a new building here, a wider road there, and an open space lost to development. It becomes difficult to understand what is at risk when these changes occur over decades. But what if we could compare where we are today by looking back at yesterday? Bergen is a harbor city, founded in 1070. As you would imagine with any 1,000-year-old town, there are clusters of buildings peppered throughout that reflect this heritage. This juxtaposition of topography and heritage forms the basis for Bergen's unique place identity. From the very beginning, it has been a trading center tied to fish, especially dried cod. The warehouses and wharves that were bustling with activity in the 15th century have been protected, although commercial use has transitioned from trade to tourism. But the harbor is still the heart of the city, with passengers embarking on cruise ships or sailings up a fjord. Working ships tied up to the toll house wharf, and recreational boats moored to the harbor wall. Bergen has been a safe harbor for centuries. The physical geography of Bergen not only provides a natural setting for the narratives that make and remake this place, it shapes the weather. Bergen is known as Europe's rainiest city. Storms roll off the ocean, and the basin captures massive rainfall as the clouds dump moisture so they can clear the mountains. Weather is almost a point of pride for locals. No matter the time of year, expect to get wet. The rain frames Bergenser's identity, notion of place, and emotional attachment to the city. You can think of the surrounding mountains and forests as a historical document, a story that holds evidence of centuries of interaction between Bergensers and nature. Local residents refer to this place as the City of Seven Mountains, although there are 9 and nobody can really agree on which 7 are the actual 7. Bergen proper is a dense urban city, hemmed in by those mountains and a fjord. Its 250,000 inhabitants spill out from the center into the surrounding valleys and islands. Land use here is framed by both laws and customs. How the land is used reflects what is valued. Because of this city's steep walls, urban growth has been limited to bands of development at the base of the mountains, winding along the valley floor and hugging the shoreline in strips from the city center. Like many communities, Bergen's urban expansion came in waves. Growth is opportunistic, migrating where there is space to build. Farms and dairies sprinkled across the valley floor have been replaced with homes and then dense urban centers. As the valleys filled, development crept up the mountain slopes. This is not a new phenomenon. From the beginning, Bergen's neighborhoods have sprouted up above the city. As the technology improved, ever larger complexes were built in the shadow of the mountains. This expansion strategy is about finding densification opportunities in previously unbuilt areas. Today, these developments, both in the center and on the mountain slopes, advance the city's goal that 50% of new housing needs to be built in the center of town. A primary force driving this densification is transportation. If you can reduce a community's dependence on the car, you can reduce its carbon footprint. The tension between growth and preserving nature can be better understood by tracing Bergen's complex relationship with the automobile. Beginning in the 1960s, urban planning emphasized building roads and bridges, all to facilitate moving cars in and around the city. Even the city's notorious curvy road pattern with few cross streets points to the road engineers' power to shape the community. During the 1980s, Bergen was characterized by urban sprawl. Both housing and workplaces were moving to the city's periphery, and the core of the city fell into decline. 10 years later, in 1990, Bergen's leadership again shifted focus, this time crafting plans that were more pedestrian-friendly and less about the car. Still, even today, new private developments are often steered by the need to include parking for worker and residents' cars. Bergen city government set a goal to reduce car traffic by 50%. But it can be argued that expanding parking over public transit and alternative modes of transportation could thwart that goal. One consequence of this urban sprawl is the lack of access to green areas by residents. Studies show that there is a negative impact on people's quality of life when there is little to no green space. Greening cities, from creating community gardens to reclaiming adjacent forest land, has become a widespread strategy for counteracting climate change. Additionally, studies show it improves well-being and increases adjacent property values. Green cities are about using nature-based solutions to create livable cities. The outgrowth of promoting wilderness and letting nature take over in urban areas is the quantifiable improvement to biodiversity. One central question in contemporary urban green space management is, what makes for a good urban green space? Just like music, food, and art, defining a personal preference for our surroundings can appear to be a matter of taste. But there are 4 criteria that we innately use when deciding if we like the view. One component to our individual preference is the coherence of a landscape. In other words, does everything fit? Are the individual elements in order? Think tree type, geologic formations, and foliage. Another is the legibility of a scene. Does it make visual sense? Third, does the complexity of the environment make you want to explore it? And finally, will that exploration offer the promise of mystery, of new information, and personal discovery? Your visual interaction shapes your preference for which landscapes you find appealing. This calculus of appeal also applies to the urban green space that comes to mind when we think green. The park. Much of Bergen's land use has been determined by the legacy of 900 years of unplanned development. A legacy where merchants, traders, landowners, and residents utilized their property in ways that best served their needs, and not necessarily the long-term needs of the city. You can imagine that developing parks in the city core was problematic, After all, nature surrounded them on all sides. I would imagine saving large plots of land in the city center may have seemed, well, frivolous. The evidence of time shows a preference for warehouses, homes, and factories. While green space in the city is limited, at least compared to most urban communities, Bergen has shown a long-standing dedication to bee parking. This formal green space in the center of town shares design and function that is common with many community parks. Ornamental vegetation that is intensively mowed, fertilized, and cultivated, with a priority on visual design over natural habitat. The reason? We like it. We find it attractive. It is coherent and makes visual sense. Another benefit to urban parks is they serve as recreational sites in close proximity to where people live. They're in essence an alternative for a trip to the wilderness. Bergen's many trails in the surrounding woodland means access can be just outside your doorstep. This is particularly the case as new housing creeps to the forest boundary, and land that had been abandoned is reclaimed by nature. In the past 50 years, there's been a significant effort to reclaim and reforest both urban land and the surrounding mountains via intentional abandonment promoting natural succession. The concept is to work with nature rather than attempting to control it. Wherever you look, you can see the impact of Bergen's recent land use choices. Areas where farming once dominated have been abandoned, resulting in forest expansion. Between 1949 and 2009, almost 80% of farms ceased operation. 50% of dairy farms were abandoned, and grazing in the surrounding mountains was significantly reduced. While this change reflects the loss of cottage farming, in some areas the outcome is an increase in forestation. Studies have shown that since 1970, an average of 25% of the vegetation at lower elevations has turned over, most of it coming as forest regrowth. What this all means is Bergen is now greener, leafier, and woodsier, with an ever-shifting boundary between urban and forest. Bergen then and now. Is it better or worse? Well, I think it depends upon your criteria. You can argue it's worse, with growth creeping up the mountainsides, less nature, and more pollution. But you can also argue it's better. We're seeing the benefits of 70 years of reforestation, and there are active conversations within the community that are shaping what the future holds. Like any community, Bergensers will need to participate to ensure the Bergen of tomorrow is both a vibrant and green city. There is a continuity to Bergen, both positive and negative. But rather than simply focusing on today, perhaps this perspective, then and now, helps to frame how the decisions about tomorrow can be shaped by the past. There is always tension when wrestling with change, but widening the time frame to centuries may help to arrive at decisions that ensure a balanced future.